So, we are continuing our series on the divine attributes, the attributes of God, the character of God, and all the various theological names which are applied to this area of what's called theology proper. For those who were not here last week, we were exploring the omniscience of God, the fact that God is, in simple terms, all-knowing. We went through a variety of different texts and saw the ways in which that's kind of fleshed out throughout the whole counsel of the Scriptures. We saw that he is knowledgeable entirely of himself, that is to say, he has complete self-knowledge. We saw that he has knowledge throughout all time, or I suppose you could word it using a word that we have used in the past. He transcends time and therefore knows all things independent of time. We know one thing in one given time because we're all here in this room right now, not before, not after, so on and so forth. And he knows things on a scale that transcends our own capability to comprehend. That's why the Apostle Paul, in one of the particular areas that we examined in Romans, gives a doxology and an exclamation and proclamation about how unsearchable the knowledge and the wisdom of God truly is. Yet at the exact same time, he has an intimate knowledge. He has a knowledge of all the stars of the heavens, and he knows them by name, we are told, throughout the Scriptures, as well as details of such finite level down to the number of hairs on one's head. So he knows it at both ends, both extremes of that scale of knowledge. And the omniscience of God, and the reason why these are all in sequential order and have been ordered the way that they are, is because, as has hopefully been evident over the 7 or so weeks that we've been going through this now, there's a lot of overlap between the various attributes, which of course makes sense. They are the attributes of the one being. They are the attributes of the one God. They cannot be partitioned, so to speak, although we here are examining them week by week, lest we be misunderstood into thinking that somehow you can slice the different attributes of God into mere isolation. We cannot. They are all the attributes of the one singular being, the one singular God, who is triune. But the omniscience, nevertheless, of God forms the foundation, so to speak, of the attributes that we're examining here in this week and the coming 2 or 3 weeks. It builds the basis and lays the theological foundation for how we're to understand things like the wisdom of God, how we are to understand things like the truthfulness of God, how we are to understand the sovereignty of God, and so on and so forth. Okay? So keeping in mind what we examined last week, that God is all-knowing, he knows all things at all times, throughout all time, that will hopefully provide the framework through which we can understand how and why God is the very embodiment and source of wisdom. Of course, wisdom is quite a prolific concept. It is a concept, it is a study, it is a virtue that has been examined and pursued and defined and studied and practiced across the ages, across cultures, across religions, across philosophies, of course. And it's something which is an inherent part to Western civilization, to our own civilization and society. The West has quite a rich tradition of philosophy, which as a term coming from the Greek philosophia, meaning in its root form, phileo, to love, sophia, wisdom, to love wisdom, or a lover of wisdom. Okay, sophia meaning wisdom. Philosophy is something that has been pursued ardently in the West, going back to Greece and to the Greco-Roman culture of ancient times. It has formulated the views and the societal development of our own civilization. There's been prolific philosophy in the East, in Asia, there's been prolific philosophy in Africa, and so on and so forth. And so this concept of wisdom is something which is quite large, even just as a kind of baseline concept on the mere mortal level, so to speak. How grand then it must be to consider that God himself is the embodiment of wisdom. And so how exactly are we to actually understand that concept of God being wisdom? It might perhaps be appropriate to actually try and define what on earth wisdom is. It's usually a helpful starting point. And of course, as I mentioned, because this has been so connected across time by so many different people, you will find no shortage of definitions and purposes and practices of wisdom down throughout the ages. Things that may constitute wisdom, things that often very much do not constitute wisdom. For example, Spurgeon gave quite a helpful definition of wisdom in his work, The Fourfold Treasures. If you just let me read to you briefly from that. He wrote this back in 1871, wherein he said, "Wisdom is the right use of knowledge." Wisdom is the right use of knowledge. To know is not necessarily to be wise. Many men know a great deal and are altogether fools for it. In fact, there is no fool so great a fool as a knowledgeable fool. But to know how to use knowledge is to have wisdom. In simple terms, he began, wisdom is the right use of knowledge. Short, terse, laconic, very simple to understand. Right? It's my own working definition that I've just kind of constantly developed and used in my pursuit and understanding of what on earth wisdom is, let alone how to actually acquire it and practice it. Right? Wisdom being the use of knowledge in the right way at the right time for the right purpose. Simply knowing something is not enough. That is merely having knowledge. It is the application thereof, knowledge, in the right way, at the right time, and for the right purpose that constitutes wisdom. That's why it's so difficult to grow in wisdom. That's why sages and wise men have been so venerated across cultures, because knowing something is just merely a matter of academic rigor, I suppose. It's a matter of just studying something, which is not an overly difficult task. It just requires discipline. A growing, though, in discernment, a related term to wisdom, and a growing in how to apply that knowledge and how that knowledge should be applied, that is where wisdom starts to become valued among societies. Does that make sense? It is the use of knowledge in the right way at the right time for the right purposes. How then are we to consider what wisdom actually is, though, substantively? What is it ontologically? It's vital to understand, and this is where we have so many texts, and we'll be exploring some of them herein, that actually point us toward what the source of that wisdom is, and how we are to then, therefore, as a basis off of that, understand that God is, by definition, wisdom. What it might be useful to do before we examine some things from the Proverbs and Isaiah and other passages we've had read is to show you a contrast which will hopefully illuminate exactly the concept that we are to understand regarding the wisdom of God. One thing that becomes quite apparent when one examines the philosophical works across cultures, both in the West and the East, is that often the pursuit of wisdom among pagan societies has been inherently and fundamentally introspective or introverted. It is inherently looking within for wisdom. Even at a kind of rudimentary level, you may be broadly familiar with the kind of, I suppose, stereotypical but well-founded stereotype of the Hindu guru, right? The guru in Hinduism. Or the Buddhist monk who spends much time in meditation and prayers and spiritual practices like yoga and so on and so forth in the Hindu context, right? Constantly meditating, reflecting in within, looking within to find the source of knowledge and of the divine and of wisdom and so on and so forth. That's true in the West as well, historically. Many of the great philosophers in the West, those like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, in ancient times, despite the fact that they said so many things which, broadly speaking, Christians could agree with, the source of their philosophical pursuit was internal. I mean, Aristotle himself said that knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. And so we see this introspective nature, this searching within, where the source of that wisdom is what or whom? Yourself. This goes for the East. You can find Eastern philosophers like Confucius and Sun Tzu and Lao Tzu, who all said the same kind of things. But what's fascinating in light of that is the stark contrast of what we find in very similar phraseology in the scriptures. Perhaps no more famously than in the Proverbs, the cornerstone of the wisdom literature throughout the Bible. And we find it repeated twice, but ultimately the most famous of which in Proverbs 9, verse 10. The fear of Yahweh, the fear of the Lord, is the beginning of wisdom. Aristotle, knowing yourself is the beginning of wisdom. God, the fear of Yahweh is the beginning of wisdom. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Your translation might say something at the end like insight. Benah could be translated as discernment, for example. Discernment, insight, understanding. The knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. But it begins with what? The fear of Yahweh, the fear of God. It's the same phraseology that's used back in Proverbs 1, verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Notice something interesting there. It might be hard to flick through, but I'll try and show you the parallel. Proverbs 1, verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Proverbs 9, verse 10. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Knowledge and wisdom parallel there in the same text, right? Ultimately, Proverbs written by Solomon as a book of wisdom for his sons. Knowledge and wisdom. Same sentence, same statement, two different words. Knowledge and wisdom. So how then are we to understand that? Well, by logical necessity, what does it tell us? Knowledge and wisdom must be what? Related. They must be connected. They're used in the same sentence, in the same way, in the same book, by the same author. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. This probably gives light to what Spurgeon was talking about when he said that merely knowing something doesn't equate to wisdom. Just having knowledge is not equal to you being wise. But nevertheless, we can see from that, even at a foundational perspective, that knowledge is the root of wisdom. Hence, wisdom being the right use of knowledge. But what's at the beginning of those statements on the part of Solomon? What is it that is the beginning of knowledge and wisdom? The fear of the Lord, the fear of Yahweh, the fear of the Holy One. How are we then to understand that? Fascinatingly, the word fear in Hebrew means fear. Not that that should come as a terrible surprise. It means more than that. There is more semantic meaning inherent to the concept of fear in both Hebrew and Greek, although there are different words for fear in Greek. But it means respect, it means awe, it means ultimately, as a consequence, subservience to, submission to the object of that fear. But the root of that is fear, is a right and healthy fear of the might, the power of the object of that fear, in this case, God. In this case, the Lord, Yahweh. Where does that fear come from? Fortunately, in Solomon's wording there in Proverbs 9, we're told where that fear comes from. Why on earth we should fear God. What is the basis for having fear? Not one that cripples you, not one that constricts you, not one that absolutely destroys you, but as a Christian, indwelt by the very same God, it is one that keeps you in right standing and relationship before him. What is the basis of that? Look back at verse 10 there of Proverbs 9. What will you see? I'll read it again in whole. Verse 10 of the 9th proverb. The fear of Yahweh is the beginning of wisdom, and, indicating to you you're about to get a classic Hebrew parallel, the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. So what's being paralleled there in classic Hebrew form? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Wisdom and knowledge paralleled. Great, we saw that, especially going back to Proverb 1. Wisdom and knowledge. The fear of the Lord equated itself with knowledge, knowledge proper. Wisdom bringing understanding, wisdom bringing insight, wisdom bringing discernment, being that last word there. Fear of the Lord being based upon what? Knowledge. Fascinating. Why? As one, and this is the purpose of this kind of series on the divine attributes. We've stated at the very beginning and we've stated throughout the purpose of searching the counsel of the scriptures in order to understand the divine attributes, understand who God is in his being, in his character, is not merely for the sake of intellectual knowledge. It is not merely an academic pursuit. What must the purpose be, and indeed here what is the purpose of this kind of teaching and preaching? It is so that you may know God in a more profound way, so that you may know him deeper, that you may grow in your knowledge of who he is in his being, and therefore from that basis grow in your knowledge of what he has done. Why? Because his actions are born out of what? His character. As we will go through and examine the ways in which we see the wisdom of God displayed, the reason why we are able to do that in the first place is because his actions spring forth from his character. There is no such concept of the actions of God in this world being somehow detached, I suppose, from who he is, from his attributes and character. Does that make sense? Yeah. It's from this basis that we understand. The fear of the Lord comes from actually understanding who God is. To understand all the things that we've examined even just thus far. That he is spirit, that he is aseatic, meaning that he is self-existent. He existed before anything else existed. He transcends time and the universe, yet he is also present within it. When you understand, and as we go through the rest of these weeks, when you understand in greater and greater degree these attributes, you will only grow in a healthy respect, awe, admiration and fear of this one true God. Because when you realize the power with which you are contending and standing before, the only right response is to fall prostrate upon your face and eat the dust. The only response is to bend the knee. And it is those who in their folly reject him, deny him, rebel against him, or worse yet, claim with absolute audacity that he doesn't even exist. It is in only such folly that you can find those who do not bend the knee. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. The fool, arguably the worst, most shameful designation that is given throughout the scriptures, that of being a fool. Not because you're dumb, not because you didn't do well in academics. A fool is categorized as the one who rejects wisdom. That's the first proverb literally says that, right? That a fool despises wisdom and instruction. Why? Because what we're seeing here is that God is the source of wisdom. That's why it's appropriate for us to even say that to pursue wisdom is to pursue God. And vice versa, right? That goes kind of both ways. To pursue God is to pursue wisdom. Literally, because he is the definition of wisdom and he is the source of wisdom. He is the fountain of wisdom. He is the wellspring of wisdom. That's why no matter what the philosophical musings of many of the great philosophers, even in the Western tradition, has been, no matter the fact that they have said statements that are fundamentally true and that they've rightly identified using logic and reason, they have nevertheless not reached God. Why? Because they were not looking in the right place. The source they were pursuing for wisdom was errant. It was false. That's why there has to be balance. You will hear me reference great thinkers and philosophers and intellectuals from the West and others, but you'll never hear me say, yes, these are the people you should follow. It is only ever whenever they agree with something in the scriptures that I will reference them, or conversely, like today, reference them for showing their error when it came to the source of wisdom. To pursue God is indeed to pursue wisdom. And there is no such concept, just like with any other attribute, there is no such concept as pursuing wisdom apart from God, detached from God. To try and engage in philosophy, to try and pursue and find wisdom separate or apart from God, is a fool's path that is long and windy and difficult and will lead you to a dead end. So, how then, broadly speaking, should we actually conceptualize the ways in which the wisdom of God is demonstrated in the world? How are we to understand his actions based off of his inherent attribute of wisdom? Like with most of the attributes that we've been examining, there's no shortage of ways in which we could conceptualize it. There's no shortage of passages that we could examine. But in typical Baptist form, we're going to use 3 of them as a typical 3-point sermon. And let us examine the wisdom of God demonstrated in creation, the wisdom of God demonstrated in salvation, right, otherwise known as redemptive history, and the wisdom of God demonstrated in providence. We'll explain what all those mean. And fortunately, most of the ways in which you would ever examine the scriptures and see how he displays and acts out upon his wisdom can actually be categorized under these three broad areas. Does that make sense? Creation, salvation, providence. So, turn with me to Psalm 19, if you would, please. Psalm 19. We'll examine first what is described about creation, and we will then exegete and elaborate upon that basis. Psalm 19 is quite a fascinating psalm, quite theologically rich. It's primarily an exhortation upon the law of God, or the law word of God in theological terms, using a series of parallelisms and descriptions, I think about 7 in total off memory, to describe the law of God. But before doing that, what the psalmist does is outline, through verses 1 through 6, the majesty and the wisdom, ultimately, of God in his creative act, in his act of creation. And that serves as a foundation and basis for the exposition on the law, which comes later on in Psalm 19. So let us read from verse 1 through 6 of the 19th Psalm. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day by day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. Interesting, we've seen that word before. There is no speech, nor are there words whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out throughout all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them he has set a tent for the sun, which comes out like a bridegroom leaving his chamber, and like a strong man, like a champion, runs its course with joy. Its rising is from the ends of the heavens, and its circuit to the ends of them. And there is nothing hidden from its heat. This is obviously a very poetic form, typical of the Psalms, in describing the glory and the majesty of creation, of the product of God's creative act. And we're told here that it even pours forth knowledge. Interesting, it pours forth knowledge of what? Or, well, two things. Of what? The fact that it was created in the first place. And secondly, of whom? The Creator. That very statement about the creation pouring forth knowledge, or speaking forth knowledge, to use the poetic form, along with plenty of other areas across the scriptures that attest to this very same concept, is how we are to understand the fact that our belief, our trust, our knowledge of God is not just merely blind. It is not blind faith, to use a kind of modern term. The very reality, and we've explained this before, but as an aside, the very existence of everything you see and know, including yourself, logically demands that someone brought it into being. This is one of the areas where we actually have referenced people like Aristotle, who were actually on the money, more or less, on this particular subject. That in the cycle of life, Aristotle using an apple tree as an example, where the very seeds of that apple tree are found in the apple itself, that falls upon the ground, that decays, that goes into the soil, that is watered, that then grows up into an apple tree which produces apples, which falls upon the ground, right? Same for us as people. We are born of our mother, who was born of her mother, who was born of her mother, who was born of her mother, and so on and so forth. It demands that eventually, at some point, someone must have started that process. It cannot logically go on eternally. This is just one of the ways in which we are to understand the creation speaking forth knowledge. It tells us, by absolute logical necessity, that a creator must exist, and that it tells us about him. What does it tell us about him? He must be really powerful. Powerful beyond comprehension, in fact. It tells us that he is an artist, and the greatest thereof, because when you contemplate and you see the incredible design on the macroscopic scale of the stars and of the planets and of the celestial bodies, as they used to be referred to, you see the grandeur. You see the sheer, just incalculable mass and size relative to our own being and existence. You see the beauty, much of which we reside among here atop this mountain. Yet you see all the way down to the most intricate of levels in our DNA and our genetics, the cellular level, in atomics and subatomic physics and all the complex areas of science. All of this on all ends of the spectrum created by this one God. What also does it tell us, though? When you read this kind of beautiful poetic language used here in the first 6 verses of the 19th Psalm, what should become apparent, especially when compared to all the other exhortations glorifying God for his act of creation, is it becomes apparent that this God must be infinitely wise. Again, here the psalmist poetically references the sun, how it runs its course in the heavens. Astronomy, right, and the study of the stars has been a major area of importance for all kinds of civilizations down throughout the ages. And you see all the ways in which this works. You see the ways when you start to understand the infinite level of complexity going on within your own body right this very second. Of cells replicating, of cells dividing, of the chemicals working in your brain as you listen to what I say, as frequency goes out from the speakers into your ears and it is then processed as intelligible sound that you can comprehend and is processed using electrical currents in the brain. The food you had for breakfast this morning being digested, being delivered via the bloodstream and else to the cells of your muscles and your bones and of the organs and so on and so forth. One of the advantages of modern science over the last 100 years is that the further we have studied genetics and some of the finer level details going on in the body, we have only realised just how exponentially more complicated it is than we ever thought before. In Charles Darwin's day, back in the 1800s, when he was formulating his theory of evolution and his atheistic creation myth, the concept of what was in a cell in the body was that it was essentially just like gelatin. It was just a gooey, gel-like substance. In fact, Darwin literally said, and I'm paraphrasing, if cells be shown in the future to be more complex than just merely jelly, my whole theory goes out the window. Fast forward many decades, we discover the intricacies of genetics and of DNA that is infinitely more complex than anyone ever thought back in the Victorian era. And fascinatingly, the theory did not magically go away. But Darwin knew that if this is how complex our own bodies must be, there's no way on earth they could have just blindly evolved over the course of millions and in fact billions of years. That is why the creation myth that is evolutionary theory falls flat on its face. The wisdom of God displayed in the gigantic magnanimity of the macroscopic level of the universe and of the heavens, of stars that are literally thousands of times the mass of our own sun, being created and moving, and yet the absolute intricacies of our own DNA given to us by our mother and our father, knitted together, to use the psalmist's words, in our mother's womb, moving from that single cell, multiplying, growing into a zygote and an embryo, into a fetus, being born as a baby. Levels of complexity which you and I just simply are not able to comprehend in totality. This is the ultimate display of wisdom, of the use of knowledge. Do you see? Everything you see around you screams the wisdom of God. Hence why the psalmist says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork." Day to day it pours forth speech, and night to night it speaks forth knowledge. The heavens, the creation, being anthropomorphized here, speaking and proclaiming this glory, majesty, and ultimately knowledge and wisdom. Every time you open your eyes, you are witnessing the wisdom of God in full array and full display. Secondly, and moving from that basis and point, we're also to understand that one of the greatest ways in which God has demonstrated his wisdom is in salvation itself, is in what is referred to in theological terms as redemptive history. So not just merely the act of saving you, not just only the cross in isolation, but rather the whole history of God fulfilling his covenantal promises and of redeeming his people. Let us examine then 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 through 25, which was read earlier in the service. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 through 25. It's one of the more important areas regarding this intersection between wisdom and salvation, redemptive history, on the part not just of the New Testament, but particularly of the Apostle Paul. And herein we read in this first chapter from verse 18 the following. "For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." So the word of the cross, the reality of what was achieved upon the cross, the witness and proclamation of that event, it is folly to those who are perishing. It is folly to those who are dead in their sins and in their trespasses, to use the Apostle Paul's terminology elsewhere. It's foolishness to them for a multitude of reasons, the least of which is the pride of life which blinds one to the reality that you even need salvation in the first place, plus many other reasons. But to us, the apostle says, who are being saved, it is the cross, it is the power of God. It is the demonstration of his omnipotence, which we look at in a few weeks. Verse 19, "For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I shall thwart." The Apostle Paul there is quoting from Isaiah 29, verse 14. Isaiah 29, verse 14, wherein Isaiah says the very same thing in his own day. In this case, quoting God as saying, "I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart." Again, paralleled. I will destroy the wisdom of the wise. What's important to understand there on that particular sentence, because it helps us understand what Paul then launches into in verse 20. The wisdom of the wise there is God using the I suppose you could say, self-descriptors of those very wise men. those who have professed themselves to be wise, whereas in reality they are not, for their apparent wisdom and sagacity has been sourced, has been acquired, has been pursued apart from God, disconnected from God. Okay, disconnected from the only true source of wisdom itself. Hence why it is able to be destroyed. I will destroy the wisdom of the wise. Why? Because it is a false wisdom. And moreover, it is a false wisdom of false wise men, of false sages, who are sages only in their own view or in the view of their culture around them. Every culture has its sages, every culture has its wise men, every culture has its experts that must be unquestionably listened to. But nevertheless, if their wisdom and their knowledge as a basis is not sourced in God, in His truth, in His law, in His word, then it is not wisdom. And it is not ultimately knowledge. It does not mean that the pagan cannot acquire knowledge. Anyone who says that 2 + 2 = 4 is ultimately correct. But nevertheless, where have they sourced that from? Creation, natural law, natural philosophy, so on and so forth. Things that are byproducts of God having created anything at all. Someone observing that the grass is green and the sky is blue is ultimately sourcing it from God, who created those very things. And so God is able to destroy the false wisdom of the false sages, right? And the false discernment of the false discerners. Right? He's able to thwart it. He's able to thwart them. And so then the apostle says in verse 20 the following: where is the one who is wise? Right? Where is the one who is sophos, wise, or has wisdom? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Your translations might say something different there, but to provide you some important context, what's he saying there? Where is the one who is wise? He then launches into two categories. Where is the scribe, referencing Jewish scribes? Where is the debater of this age? Where is the sophist? Where is the Greek teacher of wisdom? Right? Sodzetetes was a professional teacher of wisdom. Wisdom in the ancient world, especially in Greco-Roman culture, didn't just mean like kind of contemplative, meditative wisdom. Wisdom meant all manner of knowledge, right? So wisdom and understanding pertaining to mathematics, astronomy, the arts, etc., music, so on and so forth, philosophy, right? So in Paul's own day, 1st century Greco-Roman culture, himself being a Jew, speaking to Jews and Gentiles in Corinth, where is the wise one? Where is the Hebrew scribe who professes himself to be so godly and so smart with all their knowledge they brought back from Babylon? Where is the Greek sophist, the professional teacher of wisdom, who has pursued philosophy and pursued wisdom and knowledge apart from the one true God? Has God not made foolish the wisdom of the world as opposed to the wisdom of his kingdom, the wisdom of God? Verse 21, for since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. Right? So the worldly pursuit of wisdom disconnected from God does not bring you to the truth, does not bring you to true wisdom. In fact, it's a folly, and hence why the preaching of salvation is a folly to such people. Verse 22, for the Jews demand signs, and the Greeks seek wisdom. The Jews demanding a sign, they demand an ecstatic sign. They want the prophet upon the mountain. They want the person who comes speaking in tongues. They want the person who walks upon the water and who does the works of Elijah and Elisha and so on. Greeks, they seek wisdom. They sit around the Areopagus in Athens endlessly debating how many angels can fit upon the head of a needle. And they debate all the intricacies of what was spoken by Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and Zeno and all the great sages of Greece. But we, verse 23, preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to both the Jews and the Gentiles, in fact, a folly to them. But to those who are called from both the Jews and the Greeks, to those who are called by God, to those who in his sovereignty his message has gone forth, to those whom his Spirit is working in, from both the Jews and the Greeks. To them, to us, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. Christ is the power of God, and Christ is the wisdom of God. He is the very embodiment. In him, the fullness of deity was pleased to dwell, the Apostle Paul says in Colossians. The fullness of deity, all of these attributes, indwelt in and demonstrated by and through Jesus Christ. Fully God, fully man. And he is the very source of power and wisdom. He is the very power of God and the very wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God, this is a clever way that the Apostle Paul rounds this up in verse 25. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. Now, of course, you can understand the apostle here is using hyperbole. There is no such thing as the foolishness of God, nor is there any such thing as the weakness of God. But what he's saying in a hyperbolic figure of speech, even the most foolish thing of God is wiser than any of the wise men of the world. Even the weakness of God, God at his weakest, inverted commas, is still stronger than the mightiest of warriors and champions. He transcends all those things. He is the very source of wisdom, and that wisdom has been displayed in the salvation of his people and in all the things that went into and continue to go into creating the right circumstance in the fullness of time, to use the biblical language, to bring about that salvation. All the history of the Hebrews, the promises and the covenants made all the way back to Adam, salvation of Noah upon the ark, and the continuation of redemptive history through one family, all the way down through to Abraham, this man plucked out of the ancient lands of Ur and Arcadia to wander across the deserts of the Middle East to a land unknown, and a promise made to him that he knew he would never see, that his descendants would be as innumerable as the stars in the heavens. All then for his descendants to be enslaved in Egypt for hundreds of years, but then eventually through one prince of Egypt, a Jew no less, chosen hundreds of years later, Moses, whom God appeared before and said, I am who I am. I am the great I am. I am the God of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob. And tell the Pharaoh that I will free my people. And so he leads them out of slavery. He rescues them miraculously, slaying and conquering the armies of Egypt and bringing the might of the Egyptian civilization to its knees. They wander through the deserts of Arabia, only to find that they have to cross another river and find a ruthless, barbaric, horrifically evil pagan people in the form of the Canaanites, dwelling in the land that so many centuries ago was promised to their forefather Abraham. They go forth, they conquer, they bring down the walls of the mighty ancient city of Jericho, which had stood even by that point for thousands of years. They enter the land, they dwell, they eventually have a king, and then a king after him known as David, a royal house through whom ultimately the Messiah would come. But of course, troubles come, compromise enters, the serpents of deceit weave their way through the camp and through Jerusalem itself. Evil kings rise, evil kings fall, pagan queens take the throne and slay thousands. God is forgotten, the Sabbath abandoned, the Jubilees left to be, and eventually their 400 plus years of rebellion against God is met with God fulfilling his promise of covenantal curse. That if they did not obey, that if they did not uphold their end of the covenant that they swore to the one true Almighty God, that judgment would come upon Israel. And indeed it did. And so God raises up the most terrifying of pagan empires to that date, the Babylonians. And under emperors, the height of which Nebuchadnezzar II himself, they conquered Jerusalem, lay waste to the land, burn it all to the ground, slay the men, slay the women, slay the children, and take the aristocracy off into exile in Babylon. But this same God does what? Does he promise to abandon them? Does he just leave them to be for the rest of time? No. No, he promises before the conquest even happens that they would spend 70 years in judgment and in punishment. But that he would eventually raise up another pagan empire and another ruler whom, apart from Christ, is the only one referred to as the Mashiach, the Anointed. And he raises up Cyrus the Great of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. And one empire conquers another. But just as he prophesies to Daniel, that empire shall itself be conquered by men from the west. They shall be conquered by one from Macedon. They shall be conquered by Alexander the Great. Over the course of centuries and centuries and centuries, counting down to the arrival of the true Messiah, we see the geopolitical landscape of the world shift many, many times. All to reach a zenith, a climax in the first century, in which these prophecies given across the course of thousands and thousands of years, in which thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands and indeed millions place their hope for their future, for their own souls, for that of their descendants. And it reached that climax when, in the form of a baby, miraculously born of a virgin in a small backwater town known as Bethlehem, the God-man was born. And we then see all that we get throughout the Gospels, right? And we see him fulfill all the promises that were made throughout the Old Testament. We see him achieve that which God promised in his great wisdom down throughout the millennia to the patriarchs, all to then die upon the cross. An event that would otherwise seem, by any earthly standards, to be a catastrophic failure. An event in which the armies of darkness would have rejoiced, professing themselves to be oh so wise, thinking that finally they had won the war. But what on every surface level, by any reasonable metric, appeared to be a loss, to be a catastrophic failure and defeat, turned out to actually be the very act required to triumph. And the second that Christ died was the moment in which the war was won. Because if he died, as was promised, as was foretold, then the other adjoining promise would also be fulfilled. The promise that what? New life in the form of the resurrection. And indeed, up from the grave he arose on the third day, in all glory, in all majesty, triumphant over the powers of darkness and of death and of hell, having won the war. All that before we even begin to talk about the expansion and the conquest of the kingdom of God over the last 2,000 years, across that time period, hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of millions of people just in our own day, let alone what ultimately amounts to the billions across 2,000 years. To where we stand here and can look back and say that there are more Christians alive today than all the people in the world when these words of Paul were even being written. Can you conceptualize in your finite mortality the infinite wisdom required to pull all of that off? Do you understand? Unsearchable, insurmountable wisdom that could only be found in the God of wisdom to coordinate all of those things that ultimately achieve and proclaim forth his glory, which is the chief end, the chief purpose of all that we know and all that we see. And this ties into the very concept of providence itself. Providence, in simple terms, meaning the way in which God orchestrates the affairs of the world. That passage which we read earlier from Isaiah 55 explains why that's the case. He says in verses 8 through 9, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts," God speaking. "Neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so too are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts." Our God is the very definition and embodiment of wisdom itself. He is the source and the wellspring of wisdom. And for all those who would pursue wisdom, for all those who would proclaim themselves to be wise, which is a noble pursuit, your pursuit of wisdom must, by necessity, be sourced only, solely, and exclusively in the God of wisdom, Yahweh, who is that very source and fountain from which all wisdom comes. Amen.